So tonight the South Bank show goes to Australia, home of the painter Arthur Boyd. Now in his 60s, Boyd was born into one of Australia's leading artistic families and began painting as a child. He's never stopped questioning and experimenting, and although his work has passed through a wide variety of styles, one factor has always remained constant: his fascination with the relationship between man and the landscape he inhabits. Although he's trained in the European landscape tradition, his inspiration comes from a landscape that's distinctly un-European, and there's something uniquely Australian about him. On April the 8th, a major retrospective exhibition of Boyd's work opens at the Fisher Fine Art Gallery in London, and next week the first comprehensive study of his work will be published by Andre Deutsch. On its cover is one of the two landscapes which Boyd specially painted for the South Bank show while director Don Featherstone was filming at his home in New South Wales. Arthur Boyd is one of the world's leading post-war landscape artists. Although he spent many years abroad, mainly in England, he's most famous for his unique vision of the Australian outback. For the past 9 years, he's been living here, on the banks of the Shoalhaven River, 100 miles south of Sydney. Boyd's current work focuses on the relationship between the landscape and the city dwellers, who are increasingly using this primeval wilderness as a playground.
At the moment, of course, everything's tranquil and the water's calm and reflected, and there's very little interruption from outside world at all. And in a way, this is what drew me to the area. Also, the large scale of things. I mean, without the river, it would be very marvelous, but the river actually makes it into something which is quite unique. Also, the moods in the landscape and the river are so varied. One time it can be like it is now, this tranquil, and then another time it can be a roaring, raging torrent, and then very, very thundery weather and extreme storms. Perhaps tomorrow or even later on today, this place will be a racetrack of speedboats and skiers. Quite a number of people sort of using the area, as I hope they won't mess it up. And on the whole, they haven't been. But I'd like to be able to use that element in the landscape.
Boyd's about to do two paintings, which reflect the pleasure-seeking relationship Australians have with nature. He'll begin outdoors, or as he calls it, en plein air.
Well, I've planned it fairly carefully, or as carefully as I'm capable of planning it, in the sense that I want to do a large plein air painting, which I have prepared, and I want it to be of a specific subject, which is the skiers. And then I want to do the big interior painting, which will be of the skiers and the bathers. And I want to connect it up with what I will see here when the skiers do start arriving.
On the first day, Boyd and his assistant Gabrielle begin by carrying the canvas the half-mile from the studio to the river.
whole background has been that painting outside, plein air painting, was a kind of picnic. You went outside to absorb and take in and be swamped, in a sense, by the landscape. And if you're down by the river when the skiers come up and things are happening, you can either blot them out, or you can, if you think it's taking over, you incorporate the thing, and you might get something more interesting and better suited to what you might want to do later in the studio, or just what you really want to do in the landscape. I'm here because I like the natural surrounding. I like the quiet sandbanks and so on. When it becomes so intense, when the skiing activity, the hedonist activity, when that takes over, that becomes the landscape. That becomes the reason for going outside to paint the landscape.
It's the end of the first day's painting. Boyd will continue work on it when the skiers return tomorrow. Boyd is the leading member of Australia's best-known artistic dynasty. The family has produced 4 generations of painters, as well as a noted architect, sculptor and novelist. Arthur Boyd was brought up in Melbourne, where he painted many of his early landscapes around Port Phillip Bay.
The light on Port Phillip Bay is always much more soft, misty light. It never gets this strength of shadow that you get here. And there's another thing about Port Phillip light too, is that it's, I think that the actual angle of the sun, even though we're only 400 miles up from Melbourne, the angle of the sun is just that much difference. And I think that diffuses the light.
Boyd began painting as a child, and through his father, Merrick Boyd, was strongly influenced by Australian Impressionism. But in his late teens, his horizons began to broaden, leading him to paint in a different style.
In those paintings, I was trying to actually do something different, much simpler, not taking in a whole scene so much as like a close-up on a particular thing, and confining the painting to a smaller area. The self-portrait with the palette knife technique, which is a bit like the creek at Rosebud, one which is actually a very similar technique. They were both developed at the same time, and I think the palette knife worked better than if I tried to use a brush. There's a soft end to the brush, and with a palette knife it's more like using your fingers in a way, except that it's not as sensitive as using your fingers, but it's a more precise way of getting the paint onto the canvas.
Towards the end of the 1930s, contact with European refugees introduced Boyd to the emotional, subjective style of the Expressionist movement. For the first time, people became the focus of his work, and initially he chose to place them in an urban setting.
When I started to paint urban landscapes, it was easier to put the figures, the expressionist figures, into the urban landscape than it was to put them into a scene of a bay or something like that, because in the bay they became part of the landscape in a way. Whereas with the expressionist idea, they were playing or doing their act in an urban landscape, which actually seemed to fit it better. These things are either felt, imagined, and put down just as as well as you can, or as expressionistic as you go. Make the expression the thing. In a particular painting called The Lovers, there's a couple making love under a tree, and then there's a mounted ram on the right-hand side. That is the first connection I made with putting the sort of odd imagery or the expressionist imagery into the natural or Australian setting by making the animals and the humans fairly much alike. I mean, the point would be a oneness or a continuation of nature. When I started to do some pictures called the hunter pictures, where I tried to bring the bush back into the landscape, and by doing that I thought I was making it more Australian by using an Australian background in a sort of primeval fashion. That was the basis for for really thinking I'd made a step in a direction that wasn't European. It wasn't a tranquil landscape. It was a rugged, rough, inhospitable, primeval landscape. And I think that was a better solution than trying to put these particular figures in some quiet, beautiful setting.
After the war, Boyd extended his personal imagery by combining biblical and classical European themes with the Australian landscape.
With Adam and Eve, they're not running through a European glade, they're rushing out of an Australian bush with boulders. And I think that Moses is quite a biggish picture. There's a lot of Bruegel-like figures, but the background of that is tangled bush, again primeval. Of course, all painting done by white men in Australia is European. I mean, it's not anything else. But the only thing that Europeans have got, that the Europeans that live in Australia, is their natural setting. That is the Australian landscape.
It's now the morning of the second day of the riverbank painting. Boyd's faced with a problem. The weather has changed, and the light has altered dramatically.
We had a much softer light before, more diffused, and now all the shadows of the trees and in between the rocks is very, very deep, almost black. The other thing is that it's affected the blue, of course. The higher up you look, the darker it gets. But these two blues here will sort of go together. One's quite a bit lighter, which will be a lower down one, and this one, which is a bit darker, which is a pure cobalt, but there's a little bit of light in it, and that is sort of done that too. So you get a gradual thing coming down the skyline itself. That is the top of the hill has a much lighter tone, but to get it really right, that cobalt is a little bit too cold. So if I put a bit of rose madder or something in it, warms it up a bit. It gets a more accurate the higher up you look. So you can actually see that kind of purpleness, the higher you look. Well, I think in the case of the Australian, in a way, they love the landscape. Although things like the water skiers and things, it becomes a self-absorption thing, a kind of enjoyment of the landscape, an enjoyment of the body, the self-love and all that sort of thing, which isn't really constructive, but in one sense it's less damaging than nearly everything else that's going on in the outside world. When you're painting plein air, when you're out in the landscape, you are such a tiny part of the landscape. But at the same time, it takes the weight of invention in one sense, because you've got it all there in front of you. The invention doesn't intrude. You've got it all laid on, in a sense. And you can change around bits and pieces of the landscape. Over half. I think so. Well, I mean, the basis of the thing was okay, but I mean, whether or not it'll turn out all right, I don't know. But then, I mean, why should it turn out all right? I mean, look at the people around us. I mean, have we turned out all right? Are we going to be all right? I mean,
but were the skiers annoying, or did you?
Oh no, the skiers were fine. They were actually the skiers were the only thing that really made the whole thing. They really did everything. They did all the work. I only did so light.
Arthur Boyd and his wife Yvonne are joined for lunch by his assistant Gabrielle, their daughter Polly, also a painter, and her son Adam.
But Arthur, was it difficult getting up so high, getting on the ladder and sort of manoeuvring yourself around?
There was a tendency to fall into the painting, but that didn't matter. What's he cross for?
He's going to run away from the dog.
Where's the dog, Adam? The black dog. Where is he? Look here. I think he's over there. Look.
I was going on to cut out of the forest instead.
Well, why is he talking above my voice?
I'm sorry,
I know the
Dad,
most important.
Arthur, the cobalts were wonderful this morning, weren't they? And the ultramarine.
Yeah. The ultramarine was good. But that's only because you mixed it up.
In the late 40s and early 50s, Boyd's interest in pure landscape re-emerged. He painted several series, many of them in the Wimmera district in the state of Victoria. These gentler works brought Boyd his first real popularity with the Australian art buying public.
In this particular part of Victoria, that is the area called the Wimmera, where the light, you're over at the dividing range, and where the light is completely different, and it's quite, the atmosphere is hard and sharp and clear, and the light comes out of the landscape. The ones where I think I succeeded most was where the ground was changed. That is, instead of doing it straight on canvas, was to do it on chalk background, which consists of mixing titanium and whiting with a glue. And that is the light. That is what the picture will use. There's no impasto, no heavy paint. Most of the light that's in the picture comes from this ground. If you're any good, of course, it doesn't matter what technique you use or what, but this did help, I think. It was another way of dealing with the landscape. They didn't open up new ground very much, but I mean, they opened up some kind of area that people could accept as the country, and there was nothing to worry them in, no nasty-looking things that looked like people, and yet they weren't people, except the idea of a tranquil sheep grazing country or wheat country. If you like doing it and you find that it actually, that you can make a living out of it, well, you do that and as little as possible, but if you like doing something else, something better, that is, if you wanted to paint things that weren't acceptable, then you'd have to balance the two. And I mean, it can be called pot boiling or anything else. But on the other hand, there's no reason why it shouldn't be a good painting of its type.
The balance was maintained by the highly acclaimed Half-Caste Bride series. It established a recurrent pattern in Boyd's career of alternating between landscape and experimental figurative painting. The series was inspired by a trip to Alice Springs, where he had his first real contact with Australian Aborigines.
I think I only saw perhaps one Aborigine in the whole life in Melbourne. Of course, as you come up north, you see more. But in Alice Springs, for instance, the Aborigines living in the creek beds, and in the train going up there, they were in cattle trucks. There was utter segregation, completely, treated in the most barbarous sort of way you can imagine. This was in 1950. And for a long time, I did lots of drawings, but for a long time there was no way that that I could even think of putting the subject matter together, except by doing the odd landscape of the interior. But not until about 56 or 7 did I start to try and use the material that I'd got in Central Australia. It was very difficult to put it together in a socialist realist sort of fashion because I wouldn't be good enough at it, and also I don't think there's a message to be got out of it in that way. I used pretty colors. I made the face very blue, and I know that a lot of Aboriginal people don't like this aspect. I mean, I don't think they like the way that anyone would have done it, because no one wants to be seen in any sort of degradation. I don't treat them ever as lovers. I try to just make the problem one of half-castes with full-bloods. And the integration of half-castes with the tribe was very difficult, and the integration of the half-castes with white society was just as bad. And the bride was a means of bringing together, trying to. She was rejected by both the tribe and rejected both by the white society, and the idea of bringing them together was to try and make it make some sense out of the problem.
As the series progressed, Boyd began integrating these figures into their native landscape, the Australian bush. Although his Bride series wasn't appreciated in Australia, it established his reputation in England. This favourable response prompted Boyd in 1960 to move to London, where he produced some of his finest work. In England, Boyd left behind the social concerns of the Half-Caste Bride series in favour of a new theme, the mythology surrounding the idea of metamorphosis.
The idea of metamorphosis is something which is pretty ancient in all European myths, certainly in Aboriginal myths. It's a way of dealing with stories more conveniently than drawing it right through. I mean, the actual mechanics of metamorphosis are more illustratable than something which would take up 10 paintings. In a way, you could make something more concise and precise by actually illustrating metamorphosis. And I think it does tie up with the circular idea of continuation. In the Bluebird painting, there's a intertwining of the bodies, but that, again, there's a kind of mixture, there's a kind of connection that is making love as a whole rather than separate. They're intertwined to such an extent that the actual heads can be read, they can be actually reversed. And I suppose that's a way of resolving something that is so very tightly knit. You want the whole thing to be one. You don't want the kind of separate situation with the lovers. They've got to be joined. They've got to be joined to such an extent that they can't be undone.
In this outdoors painting, Boyd is exploring his new theme, that of the hedonism of Australian society. Boyd's approach emphasizes the gulf between the landscape and the city dwellers, who come here only as visitors to water ski and sunbathe.
One of the bases for the whole idea came out of a painting in the National Gallery of Cézanne's where the feet of the bathers looked like flippers. That is one of the trite connections, in a way, that can set off a whole series of ideas. I think the main reason for the figures being incongruous in the landscape is mainly that I didn't want to try and paint something like those marvelous impressionists that got absolute accuracy through the figures, because the figures are supposed to be an excrescence on the landscape. Of course, they like being there because it is tranquil, and even though the noise is terrific with the boats and everything else, the people don't seem to actually fit in the same way they did in the early paintings. I mean, the only thing left there is the umbrella and the dog, really, that is faintly reminiscent of that period in painting. These figures here are absolutely nothing like the figures that will be in the studio painting. But I'd like to make the figures much more dominant and keep the actual rock as the central thing, and perhaps put the skiers back in the background somewhere, and not have the and not treat it in this way where the figures are actually much smaller than the landscape. I'll make them dominate to such an extent that they will become even more, not necessarily amorphous, but there'll probably be more of them, and I think in that way I will make the point much more by keeping them larger and not trying to reduce it to just a landscape with figures, but to actually make them in some way very, very important in the painting.
This painting signals a new direction in Boyd's work. Instead of drawing parallels between man and nature, he now presents an image of man out of harmony with the landscape. While Arthur Boyd was painting outdoors, the landscape and the boat dominated his impression of the scene. In the studio, however, he feels free to change the balance between the different elements in the picture.
The whole background of the family background was to do landscape painting. And then, of course, when you did get into the studio, you altered that, you changed that, you thought about figures and things. There was no way that you went out into the landscape to change it, to mess about with it. I mean, you did that in your head. That was an intellectual activity or an intellectual exercise. When you were trying to do art, you went into the landscape, you took it back, and then you did the art from the studio.
In 1968, still living in London, Boyd's interest returned to religious themes. This powerful series is taken from the story of King Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible. It was partly inspired by the political unrest of the time.
At that stage, there was a lot of protest taking various forms, I think connected with Vietnam and peace movements generally, I think. But that the people were actually setting alight them. So quite a few people were doing this on the Heath, on Hampstead Heath, and we lived in Hampstead. That was sort of a bit close and had quite a moving effect. That was one of the reasons for motivating Nebuchadnezzar, the idea of him being cast aside and in the wilderness, and being on fire, and all the imagery.
Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws.
The Nebuchadnezzar series was an intense statement on the human condition. He spent 5 years on it, and the paintings are considered among his most beautiful. Boyd then moved to a more personal theme, the frustrations of the artist.
The particular paintings where I painted the artist in the landscape. What I wanted to do was to not only have him in the landscape, I wanted to have him painting inside, but also with the landscape outside. In other words, he's being separated from the landscape by the cage. And he's also inside a cage. In one picture, he's got his head in a cage. The cage is attached to the tree, so no matter what he does, he's tied down. But then I think everybody's a bit like that. You know, I think everyone's sort of tied themselves down. They've tied themselves up to some kind of sop to their conscience. At least I wake up in the middle of the night and think that's what it may be. Well, the artist's role in society would be to do as much as he can about not letting the world fall to bits. It's a nasty thought not to be able to do enough, or to know that you should be doing more and not to do it. He's paralyzed to do what he wants to do because he's maybe torn between painting pot boilers, I don't know. So he's scooping up the money with one hand and his brushes in the other hand. But that way of dealing with a problem that the painter may have or may not have, I think was an excuse, as well as a problem, but it was an excuse to paint about the problem of painting in a very literal sense. I mean, because in a way the problem about painting, or the difficulty of painting, should never be seen or even talked about. It should just, the painting in a way should be good enough. But it doesn't seem to matter what the subject matter is really. I mean, even if it is about a painter painting, be a good or a bad painting.